Time doesn't erase murder. It just hides it better. They said the case was closed. They said no one was watching. But someone always is. This is Santana True Crime.
Welcome to Santana True Crime. Tonight we're discussing the disappearance of Ashley Loring Heavyrunner. But this story is about much more than one missing person. Ashley's case represents a crisis that has affected the indigenous communities across North America for decades. The missing and murdered indigenous women movement exists because far too many Native women and girls have disappeared or been murdered, often receiving far less media attention and fewer investigative resources than other cases. Families have spent years fighting to make sure their loved ones are not forgotten, and that is one of the reasons conversations like this matter. True crime should never just be about telling a story. At its best, it keeps cases in the public eye, encourages witnesses to come forward, holds institutions accountable, and reminds families that they have not been forgotten. Every time we shine a light on an unsolved case, we create another opportunity for someone with information to finally speak up. Ashley's family has waited nearly 9 years for answers, and they deserve nothing less than our continued attention. I'm honored to be joined tonight by two outstanding guests. First, I'd like to thank Jayson Blair. Jayson has dedicated an incredible amount of time researching Ashley's disappearance, building relationships within the community, speaking with those closest to the case, and working to separate fact from rumor. His commitment to seeking the truth has helped keep Ashley's story alive, and we're grateful that he's here tonight to share his knowledge. I'd also like to welcome Michele Wood. Michele recently retired after an outstanding 25-year career with the Chicago Police Department, much of it investigating homicide cases. Michele, congratulations on your retirement, and more importantly, thank you for a quarter century of service to your community. Our goal tonight is simple: to focus on the facts, walk through the timeline of Ashley's disappearance, and discuss where the investigation stands today. Jayson and Michele, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's always great to be on and have a conversation. I know we've talked about Ashley's case many times before, and I always appreciate your insights on things and your perspective on cases. And I'm always grateful for the opportunity to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous people. It's become a real passion of mine, and a passion on my podcast and my other work. So always grateful to be able to have a conversation like this.
And that's something that I don't think people realize, just how big of a crisis this is and how many of these cases could have been solved if law enforcement had the resources that they did and the public had the knowledge that these things were going on.
Yep.
One of the things we talked about off the air was the Nancy Guthrie case, which we covered last week, about the update of a rumor, which I think is kind of unfounded, and where maybe her body is in Mexico. What do you think would have happened in Ashley's case if she would have gotten the attention that Nancy's case got?
Yeah, I mean, if I give it a real objective look, and sort of explore what I know about the early case timeline, I think that if you had 1/10 of the FBI response, or even 5% of the FBI response, you would have been likely to have solved the case. And, I recognize in a lot of missing persons cases, the vast majority of people who go missing are found within the first week or even within days. And, you get to a month and it's usually somewhere around 80%. Only 1% of people who go missing are long-term missing. And but one of the great pieces of advice that I think detectives have said to me over time who have worked these long-term cases, if you treat every missing persons case like it's a homicide, you're not going to be worse for it. And I recognize they don't always have the resources, and that certainly happened in Ashley's case. But if there had been 1/5, 1/10, 25th of the response in this first few weeks, I actually think this case, 9 years ago would have been solved in the months afterwards.
And Michele, I think you've got a unique perspective on this, coming from someone that's actually worked homicides for a large part of your career, and you're in one of the cities that normally it's like at least a top 3 in homicides, right?
Yeah, it depends on who's counting and which way they're counting.
And how you're counting.
Right. And so getting ahead of this, and especially when you have a missing person, can you talk about the importance of that? Like when law enforcement gets involved and how big of a gap and how that impacts the investigation?
Well, I think what Jayson was saying about treat it the same way that you would a homicide investigation is true. We do have a lot of missing person cases where the people are found almost immediately, but the ones that you don't, those are the problematic ones. So a lot of times you lose everything. You lose evidence, you lose leads, you lose interviews of people that initially might have been willing to come forward and later on are not. So, and then a big problem is for some reason people still think that you have to wait 24 hours to report someone missing. And that's just not true. Someone could be gone 10 minutes, and if you think something happened to them, you are able to file a missing persons report. They still say that on TV a lot, and I'm always surprised because I'm like, that's not true at all. But in this particular case, I think the element of time was probably, and Jayson could probably attest to this, the most problematic because of the fact that she wasn't even considered missing till, whenever they reported it to the FBI, which was what, like 8 months later?
8 months later for the FBI. Yeah. And I think the BIA probably a month in or 5 weeks in did their first search for her, but it truly wasn't classified until 8 months afterwards. And I think you make a really, really, really good point about, one, the 24 hours thing being a bit of a myth, but that idea of collecting early evidence is so important in cases like this, and the cases that I've covered. A month later, floor may no longer smell like bleach, or a month later, part of the digital trail may be gone, a phone may be missing, or something may be going on that's there. So really, I think, one of the things I've heard from law enforcement who work these long cases, that as an officer or an investigator or a family member, really pay attention to the pattern of life changes. When you're looking at something that the person almost always does, like call their mom or their grandma or show up at a certain place, that is when when you have that gut feeling based on that, that's when you really need to act. And one of the problems that I think I've run into in this case and in other cases, sometimes the families are able to really articulate why this is a big deal, half a day later, 2 days later, 3 days later, but the investigators don't really hear that part. Like, she called her grandma every Sunday, and I'm not saying that about Ashley, but just in general, that is big, and that means something. And, I think sometimes families do not know how to articulate to law enforcement why the situation is so odd. So I think really both families being able to communicate it and law enforcement being able to react to it is really important. So I think that's a great point.
Right. I mean, you made a good point. We have social media now. So that's usually a big factor for so many people, like, how regular someone posts or, connects with people on social media, when they completely just like fall off for 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, and in this case, 18 hours. I think that's a big clue for law enforcement as to like, okay, what is going on here that this person is falling out of their daily activities. And that also gives us a timeline to when something might have happened to the victim.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point in this particular case, and I know we'll get into it, but one of the real challenges in this case is there is a 6-day window when you listen to all the people who are around. There are many people who last saw her on one day, and then there's someone else who has a story about seeing her 6 days later and spending time with her. So law enforcement, I think, because of that late reaction when they started the investigation, they started with what, in retrospect, is most likely the wrong date.
Yes.
And spent a lot of time looking at the wrong date.
Right,
Well,
Laura,
let's
if
talk
they would have
about
done
that.
the interviews, right, if they would have done the interviews immediately, they would have been able to like corroborate or not corroborate stuff like, okay, this guy clearly did see her or this person didn't see her. I mean, even the way that she went missing when this McDonald said that, she was there 1 minute and then she was gone the next, you would have been able to corroborate something like, okay, she was there. Where's her stuff? Did she bring her stuff with you to your home? What was she wearing? Did she leave anything there? And then you could have collected that evidence and it would have either, shown, yes, she really was here at that time, or no, she was not.
Mm-hmm. I think something as simple as, in that part of the story, and I know we're getting ahead of ourselves, but, Sam McDonald, who you're talking about, said he was driving her to a location on top of a mountain, but on the drive, she told him, well, he was actually driving her home. She told him to take her to this location on top of the mountain. One question that he wasn't asked for a long time is, how did she communicate with anyone to change her plans? So what happened to that phone, right?
Well, let's just go ahead and jump into this
Okay.
because y'all are all beating around the bush and bringing up some really good points. And it is so eerie to me in this case, little foreshadowing, when she is texting with her sister and her sister does not believe that she's actually talking to Ashley. But Jayson, can you start out with who Ashley was? Where was she at in life? And then we'll get into the last day that we know that she was not missing.
Yeah. So, Ashley Heavyrunner was born in November of 1996 in Browning, Montana, which is the major city in the Blackfeet Reservation, about 5 million square acre reservation that runs along the Rocky Mountain front. So the eastern side of the Rockies in western Montana. She was born Ashley Loring. She took on the name Heavyrunner, which came from her father's side of the family, to honor Chief Heavyrunner, who is a Blackfeet leader. And that just gives you an idea. Chief Heavyrunner was actually killed by the U.S. Army, even though he had safe conduct passes. But it just gives you an idea that she really cared about these issues. And before she disappeared, one of the things that she said to her sister, she had read about missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. And she said, I really think I want to do something in my life that helps these women. And it was only months before she disappeared. So Ashley and her sister, most of their life, and her sisters and her brother grew up on the Blackfeet Reservation. They had a brief detour to Wyoming at one point when they were really young. And when they came back to Wyoming, they actually lived on their grandparents' ranch on the reservation. She became a true animal lover. One of my favorite stories about Ashley that tells you everything you need to know about her personality is they had this dog named Fluffy. And her older sister, Kimberly, wanted to adopt the dog. And so Ashley, when she's a little kid, probably about 6 years old or 5 years old, wrote up a contract for her sister. And it was an adoption contract. And she took Fluffy's paw, put it in mud, and signed it, and then made Kimberly sign it before adopting Fluffy. And so, it tells you a little bit about Ashley as an optimistic person, as a really caring person. She eventually really started to excel academically and athletically at Browning High School, which is the main high school on the reservation. She was a star athlete, played basketball, ran. If you look at the reservation, 100% of the students at Browning High School are on free and reduced lunch. Only 30%, it's not even 30% right now, it's a little under 30%, go off to any education after high school. And so Ashley was one of them, who went off to 2-year school. She went to Blackfeet Community College, wanted to major in did major in environmental science. She was so talented in school. Another community college on the other side of the state actually invited her to come over and give a presentation on the buffalo to their class. And her ex-boyfriend talks just about how amazing she was and how impassioned she was. What eventually happened, though, is that a year before she disappeared, her grandfather, who had raised her on the ranch, died. And then also she broke up with her first love and her boyfriend, who was her boyfriend at the time. And they stayed close and they stayed as friends, but those were two really big blows. One of the things that I think really happened, like a lot of people on reservations and in other communities, she fell into using drugs. Meth is really big on the reservation during this time. And I think what essentially happened is she had a core group of really good friends who were not in that space. So she started hanging out with a much older crowd. And it's not to say, I do not want to pretend to say that Ashley's life was a bed of roses before the point where she disappeared or this happened. There was one point where the way she ended up on the ranch with her grandfather was because the kids were taken from their mom for a brief period of time. And part of the reason for that, ultimately, I was able to get the records on this. A birthmark was mistaken for a bruise, but as you know, Child Protective Services is not coming in just for the one thing that they say. There were challenges there, and there are other challenges that we don't talk about much, but it just gives you an idea of what life on a reservation was like. In March, before Ashley disappeared, she was scheduled to be a witness in a trial. And it was a trial of, the story is so wild. It was a trial of two brothers, Matson brothers, on the reservation. And when Ashley was about 16 years old, she had been on Two Medicine River in the reservation with a friend of hers. And they had gone over there with the Matsons. Some kind of fight happened between some of the men. One pulled out a gun, started chasing Ashley and the other guy with a gun, firing and shooting at them. They hid. The only reason I think they weren't killed in that moment is an FBI agent, retired FBI agent, happened to be fishing on the river, was able to call in law enforcement. Luckily, though, she never had to testify, and the Matson brothers both pled guilty on the charges. But the wild part of this, just give you an idea of how wild this is. Years after Ashley disappeared, there's a guy named Big Al. I don't think a lot of people haven't talked about his last name. I don't want to be respectful there, but Big Al's house is the last place Ashley was seen. And he was murdered by one of the Matson brothers afterwards. So you see the nexus of violence around you. And one of the important things in thinking about victimology and thinking about risk, we think, is a person involved in drugs? Are they involved in sex work? Are they involved in all these things? But we don't talk about the environment that's around them. Because I think that if, Ashley had grown up where I am in Loudoun County, Virginia right now, the drug use or some of the other things she was involved in would have been a brief teenage stage of struggle, because there are all these safety nets around you. And she was flying without those safety nets. So in the 3 months before Ashley disappeared, her sister, Kimberly, who is her closest friend and one of her supports. So you think her grandfather's died, she's broken up with her boyfriend. Her other big support is Kimberly. She was in Morocco with her fiance's family. And so what happened is, in my mind, Ashley was without one of her key supports beside her. So Kimberly and Ashley worked really hard to communicate every day. And right before, on June 5th, sort of the last solid date we have evidence that Ashley was around, Kimberly was flying back from Morocco. And what really tipped Kimberly off that something was wrong, she and Ashley were talking for the whole trip. And then once she arrived, she got no message from Ashley. So that puts us at June 5th of 2017. Later, it was discovered there was a video of her at a house in Browning. A party seemed relatively low key. She was sitting on the edge of a couch. But she essentially vanished, and the family almost immediately reacted because they knew it was so odd that she wouldn't have messaged. During that time, her own father started to get sick within 10 days of that point. And when he ended up in the hospital, and the broader community knew he was in the hospital, they knew she was nowhere around. There's no way she got that message and didn't show up at the hospital for him. So those are the big events early on.
And she's communicating through Facebook Messenger, right?
Yeah, constantly communicating through Facebook Messenger. It's the way she communicated with most of her friends. It's the way she communicated with Kimberly. She was known to lose her phone on occasion, but she would find someone else's phone and jump back on Messenger and communicate. So it was a very, very sort of regular pattern of engagement. So this fact that she doesn't communicate with her, and even, before she arrived, they had been talking about Ashley leaving Browning and moving to Missoula and living with Kimberly. So the fact that there wasn't any communication about these things or any communication period was really alarming. Later in that month, after the family's begun searching and they've reported her missing and the BIA's been notified, a tip comes in that a young woman was seen on the 6th, so the morning of the 6th, running away from a man on top of what's called Divide Mountain. It's called the Divide. And that was right near this very distinctive Blackfeet memorial. So the person had a very candid memory of what happened. And this tip came in because Ashley was missing. And they mentioned a 2-door blue car with a man in it chasing this woman. And that's what led to the first real search, first started by the family, then the BIA joined that first search. A few weeks later, a man named Sam McDonald comes forward with a story. And in his version of the story, he was at a party at Big Al's house, picked up Ashley. So this would have been the second party she would have been at that night, and took her to his cabin on a lake, St. Mary's Lake, which is just sort of north of Browning. And supposedly, according to Sam's story, Ashley spent the next 5 days with him, or 6 days, depending on how you count it. And they were at the cabin. She was there, then she disappeared. She was very erratic, he said. But essentially his story is she spent those 6 days with him. They were doing drugs, other things along those lines. But he had just decided, according to the story, that he had had enough with her and it was time to take her home to her parents' house. So it was a Sunday morning.
Can I ask you one question here? Because I know we did this last time.
Mm-hmm.
When you say cabin, I'm thinking Montana, this like very scenic view.
I mean, it's got a
nice
view.
Wood fireplace.
It's a beautiful view, but It's a shack. I mean, like, it's essentially a shack. It's relatively decent inside, but I wouldn't say nice. I mean, when I was there, the side of it's falling off of it, essentially. There's a bunch of junk in the yard. There's other things. What it is it's beautiful because the lake itself is beautiful behind it. But it is, like many of the houses along this stretch of the lake, truly dilapidated.
And about how old is Sam?
Sam would have been in his early 50s. And, so Ashley, he at least had 30 plus years on Ashley at the time. So,
And Michele, when you're looking at cases like this where there is a pattern of drug use and you've got a young girl with an older guy, clearly they're together not because they've got things in common besides drugs. Do you take any different approach to things, or are you just kind of following the same standard of developing a timeline or whatever your investigative strategy is?
Well, I think with someone that admits that they use drugs like this person did, and just the fact that he did, I believe, have a sketchy history at that point, um, I think that you would have to take everything he says with a grain of salt. And then you would also have to understand that perhaps his timeline is wrong. Maybe not even because he's lying, maybe just because of his, things that he remembers isn't exactly the way that it happened because of drug use and because of,
Right.
whatever his mental state is. But I mean, it is obviously problematic for a 50-something-year-old man to be engaging in sexual activity with a girl that is young and is on drugs and is perhaps going through something, some mental problems or depression or, something like that. So it would seem that he would be a bit of a predator. And I've seen the interviews of this guy. So I think part of my perception of him is based also on those interviews. I mean, living in the shack and the history also of that shack and what things may or may not have gone on there is definitely problematic. But, if this girl's looking for help for someone and this guy takes her in, and instead of trying to get her, set her in the right direction, this girl didn't start off using drugs and didn't really come from that. Her close friends were not about that kind of activity. Yeah, it's definitely problematic. I'd probably still work it the same way, but I don't know that a lot of the stuff he said could be just taken as factual without, really trying to corroborate and also find out exactly where he was. Like he said that they were holed up in this house for, 4, 5, 6 days. Did anyone else see them during that time? Are there any people in the area? Is there any type of digital evidence that we could get even from his cell phone? Or, a lot of people that I know you, Jayson, you mentioned that she spoke to people on Messenger. In my experience, people that often use Messenger are people that don't have cell service. So what they're doing a lot of times is they're using Wi-Fi. And, so it is a way to communicate with people and stay in constant communication. I mean, because now you could go to McDonald's and get Wi-Fi. I'm sure that there's areas that are on the reservation in the area. It might not be like a big city, but she's still going to have areas where she could connect and then log on to, whoever's phone or laptop or, tablet.
And you are absolutely correct. Everything you said is literally correct. There's some bad spots, but there are some specific places in downtown Browning that people know they can go to get Wi-Fi and communicate. And that was, that's part of the reason why I think Messenger was used so frequently. But I think you make a really good point. There was an opportunity in that moment to, as an older adult, engaging somebody younger who's in trouble. There's a real opportunity there to help them toward a better outcome. And that tells you something about somebody. And it also tells you, to your point, you don't have a lot, even if you're not involved, you don't have a lot of credibility with me at this point. It's not a matter of whether I like you or not, but you're telling me something about yourself that would alarm me. And, one of the interesting things about the story of him taking her home that I realized when I was down there is that it's hard to tell until you're there and you're dealing with the elevation. But from Sam's cabin, you can sort of drive out and take a left and go, because it's the Rocky Mountain front, so you have the plains right there. You can take a left, stay on flat land, and sort of go in a bit of a circle and end up in downtown Browning. It made no sense, added miles, to go straight up the mountain to take him, because to get to Browning, the path that he picked to get to Browning makes absolutely no sense. Another thing that makes no sense is as you go up that path on the mountain, there are plenty of great drop-off sites, including that Blackfeet Memorial spot, but there's several wonderful. The one that he describes is an impossibly small one. It's very difficult to get someone there. And it's the kinds of things that in listening to his story, if I heard it earlier, I would want to know, is this guy trying to explain away why he was here at this particular point or why somebody would have seen him here at this point? So I would want to corroborate everything I could about that story.
Yeah. And you also wonder with his history of, drug use and everything else, if he's just trying to implant himself in a story that he has nothing to do with. That's another option.
And I mean, a very, very, very good point. And, one of the things that I think I've spent time trying to figure out from other people, is he just a habitual liar? Does he just lie? Does he just make stuff up? And that's definitely something that I've explored. I mean, one thing that I don't know that law enforcement, I would hope by now law enforcement has corroborated this. And there hasn't been a lot of coverage of this, but we do have now 2 witnesses who saw him with her on the night of the 5th. And that's a new piece of information.
Okay.
So
that's huge there then, because it is funny when some of the statements that he made that I read through, I'm like, okay, if he is, placing himself in the story, I wonder if he's telling a story from a different time and then just changing the dates intentionally or not intentionally, or he knows that she's deceased at this point and he's trying to, change the facts of the story to be like, no, she was alive on the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and, try to, throw a wrench
in the timeline. Right.
Well, that's a good point with the timeline too, because if you think about if they're sitting around his cabin smoking meth and they're smoking meth until they run out of meth, they're up for potentially days, right? And then he's going to come down off of it.
If I could give you context, I don't think he's going to run out of meth. I mean,
so he's cooking at his cabin.
Oh no, not cooking at his cabin, but
he's just got a lot of meth.
There's not a chance he's going to run out of meth.
Okay.
So when he got tired of her, do you think that was kind of a euphemism for?
It could have been. I mean,
something happened to her.
To Michelle's point about lying and moving the timeline, and kind of ties into your point. My experience, just the journalism experience, the way people tend to lie, and there are different shades of it. But when people tell long, elaborate lies, often there's a lot of truth in it, right? Because you know what you want to lie about, but you're telling a really long story. And this is why interrogations, I think, go on for so long, right? You're telling a really long story. So you've got to fill it in with like real things and real recall. So I do think there's some truth in his story, but it's incidental, accidental truth.
Yeah, and because it's really hard to just make up stories. Like if I said, Jayson, where do you live? And you knew that you were going to lie to me, you still are going to pick something that you know in your head. And you're not going to, if I said, what intersection did you live at? You're still going to pick something from your memory. And you might try to throw me off by, picking one of your friends' addresses from when they grew up or, a street.
Another neighborhood. Yeah.
But you are not going to be able to just make a place up that you have no connection to. It's just not how our brains work.
And I think that's the one way you could look at his story. And this is just sort of a hypothetical, but imagine a lot of what he said, like your point about he just got tired of her. It's true. He just got tired of her at some point. Or where he kept on saying that she ran away from the house. Well, maybe she did run at some point. And we got a story about a girl running on a mountain, right? And maybe he did go up to that spot and drop her off. But maybe this is all about things that happen on the night of the 5th and the 6th. And maybe the drop off wasn't really a drop off, right? And it's an explanation of why he was there. So I could see there being truth in his lie, essentially, if it is a lie. And, I walked into the case really thinking that there were multiple potential suspects and very open to different pieces of it, but the more I spend time with it, the more things point back to that, really paying attention to that period of the 5th and the 6th, and finding those people who either interacted with her or interacted with him before he interacted with her. So there's that piece of it, and we also have, we've had conversations with the neighbors who are nearby about whether they saw anyone there on the property during that time, or anybody came through their yard, or other things like that. And there hasn't been a confirmation. There's been one family member of his who has said that she was there, but I believe that about as much as I believe your mom giving you an alibi.
Can you give people a perspective of like how close these neighbors are?
Oh, I mean, I could hit them with a baseball and I can't throw that far, but it's through some trees, not a clear view. If I estimated it, I would say it's probably like under 30 yards, or maybe 30, 40 yards.
Okay.
Some trees.
Did Sam McDonald have a history of hanging out with younger girls like that? So is there any possibility that if someone see a female there, they're just going to assume that it was Ashley and it was someone else? Like, is that a possibility at all? Or would it have been odd that he was with such a young woman?
Totally a possibility. It would not be odd. I mean, he certainly spent time, and there were adult women and men who came to his property. But some of the stories why don't we just take what he said himself? In his interview with ABC News, the reporter clearly asked him, why would a girl that young spend time with a man that old? And he said, I have drugs, they want drugs. They're women and I want women, and that's the way it works. So we found accounts from the neighbors of women running from his house half clothed, including the story of one woman who ran into the lake. Now, these are stories from the neighbors. We haven't actually found the women. So there are stories of other women being there. What one of the neighbors said to me, though, was when a young woman showed up at his house, we were all paying attention.
And then them running, did he do something specific? Like, did he have an MO of running after them? When he got so high, he pulled a knife out, or is there anything like that? Like why they would have been running from him?
Yep. Unclear for me. And I mean, it could be a lot of different things, to your point, but not sure why.
Yeah, I still find it just interesting that he gave that story about the path that he was taking. And if you've got neighbors that are that close, I wonder if he worried about his truck being seen heading in that direction.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that.
Well, so remember, a $2 car was seen on the 6th, on the morning of the 6th. $2 cars are not particularly common. I've looked at the percentages. I've looked at the percentages in the state of Montana during that year. Not particularly super common. And then it is a earlier model Monte Carlo that he has. And that really fits the description of the car.
Oh, wow.
On the sets. Yep. Down to the color.
Okay.
So
that's interesting. And then, Jayson, I know that at some point, and tell me if I'm jumping too far ahead, there was clothing that was found on the side of the road that kind of went along with the story that the 911 caller that a woman was being chased.
Yeah. So there are two spots where clothing was found. Both of them sort of, if you look at it, where the Blackfeet Memorial, where the girl was seen running, is south of Sam's cabin on US 89. And then, you pass an entrance to Glacier National Park, then up the mountain is the memorial. And then further south from there is where he said he dropped her off. So if you sort of swing in the opposite direction, almost equidistant to where the Blackfeet Memorial is to the north, that's where the first set of clothing was found. And then a second set of clothing was found closer to the Canadian border, a couple miles up. And that was in a site that people use to throw away their trash. So there was a sweater found, boots, and a shirt. Turned over to the BIA, disappeared. Ashley's sister, Kimberly, went to Washington to testify at a Senate hearing. Miraculously, that day it was found. So it was, yeah, right. So it went off to the FBI at that point.
It's funny how those things work.
It's wild.
Can you
Did anyone verify that it might have been her clothing? Because I know people were saying that the possibility that she had a gray sweater on, but was it something where they went and asked the neighbor, did she have this on, or did they independently, canvass and say, what did you see her wearing? What did she normally wear?
I think the FBI has done that.
Okay.
I think what you can say, which is unclear because all we have is one video shot of her that night. It doesn't match what she was wearing, but then again, she was indoors at that point. So it's hard to tell what she had with her, and somewhat hard to, there are people who say they saw her during that time, but I don't know what the agents have done with that piece of it. What I can say is we haven't heard anything, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't something there.
Right.
Yeah.
So Brian wanted to ask, how quickly did Sam come forward with this information?
Brian has a very good question. So Sam came forward more than a month after the 5th with his story. And Sam came forward after rumors started going around town that he had taken or he had picked up Ashley that night. So rumors were already circulating that he had picked her up that night. Those rumors appear to be based on stories Sam was telling people. So he had put some kind of version of something out there in the community. People reported that to Blackfeet law enforcement. Before Blackfeet law enforcement contacted him, he then came forward.
So is this kind of like Delphi, where this case starts getting some attention and he knows that he's involved in some capacity, and so he feels that getting ahead of it is going to help his case?
I mean, I don't know if that's what happened, but it certainly feels that's a possibility, if that makes sense.
That does. And so this goes on. They find the clothing. And how does law enforcement treat this? And I know there's some complications because you've got a whole variety of law enforcement that is kind of involved, right? You've got the reservation police. You've got the
Bureau of Indian Affairs has co-jurisdiction with them.
And then you've got the FBI involved as well.
Yeah, and the FBI is there based on something called the Major Crimes Act, which is law. I think it's 1885. The law was passed, but it basically said that federal law enforcement would handle a long list of very serious crimes that occur on reservations. And most people are familiar with Killers of the Flower Moon, about the Osage murders that went on. And really, if you look at it, the FBI itself, its origin story is built in, solving and addressing the Osage Indian cases. I'm trying to think of when, 1930s. But essentially, the FBI is responsible for those major crimes, which include murder, robbery, all sexual assaults, certain cases that involve children. So one of the real tricks to that, you have to keep in mind, the FBI, despite what you might see on Criminal Minds or the vast majority of FBI shows, the vast majority of FBI work is white collar crime, terrorism, things that do not relate to what a homicide detective in Baltimore or in Los Angeles or Chicago is going to do. So FBI agents don't have a lot of experience investigating homicides. The only time they're really doing it is either as investigative support for another agency, think the behavioral analysis unit, or when they're on reservations. So that's one of the real, I think, challenges in general that you run into with the FBI. They're in a different space, unless they've done organized crime or something like that, but you're still investigating it in a very, very different way. When it's
right. And there's not even, like in Chicago, for instance, we don't deal with the FBI at all unless we're looking to do RICO cases.
Right.
If we're looking at organized crime, namely gangs in Chicago. We've been able to build RICO cases when we can't charge them locally with a murder because, the witnesses don't want to come forward or something like that. And the only time they really get other stuff is when it interferes with interstate commerce. So I always tell people, I'm like, the feds don't charge people with murder. People charge them with all other types of things that are kind of precursors to the murder or things that happen after the fact. But when when we get the feds involved, it is usually to use their resources because they do have a better crime lab than we do, and they are able to analyze evidence, specifically DNA, a little bit better than we can, and cell site towers and things like that. They have more advanced technology than we have access to.
And I think so. Think about it, and that all great points that really tie into. You have one law enforcement agency, the Blackfeet law enforcement, that are not allowed to investigate murder. You got another, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is not allowed to investigate murder. And then the leads are the FBI, who barely investigate murder.
Yeah.
So you see what it's not a recipe for success.
And when you talk about things like losing key evidence right off the bat and having, essentially them being embarrassed in front of Congress as a way to find these things, that doesn't give me a lot of hope.
Well, if you want a little less hope, one of the real challenges for the BIA, and I don't mean to beat them up because they've done amazing work in many of these spaces, including creating a missing and murdered national missing and murdered unit. But one of the real challenges for the BIA is often you're hiring people from these vast reservations to be agents on the reservations, or they begin to live there. They come from a different place. And, one of the BIA agents in this particular case was in a relationship with one of the early suspects, having an affair with one of the early suspects. We found, to the point where we've pulled records from a fight that his wife had with this early suspect in the hospital. There were incidences where he was sharing information from the case file with this woman, and was caught red-handed doing it in front of the family. He also discouraged the family to go to the FBI. He told them, if you bring the FBI in, this case will never be solved, right? So you've got those kinds of problems existing. Those same small town problems that often pop up are existing within this exact same context. So now what I will say though about the FBI agents, the early FBI agents who came onto the case, didn't have the experience, but definitely made the effort, attempted to collaborate with other law enforcement partners. They really did do a lot of hard work, but when you look at their early investigative steps, even 8 months later, you can pick up on the lack of experience. And then they're crippled by the fact that they're 8 months behind.
Yeah.
And some of the best moments, to your point, Michele, there are a couple moments later on, 5 years into the investigation, where one of the people that they think has information on the case gets caught in the middle of sort of like a drug running thing. He's running drugs from Washington State to Montana. And then the entire FBI Safe Trails Task Force was able to get involved. So it was local law enforcement, it was the reservation, it was FBI agents, it was marshals, it was DIA agents. And the work that they were able to do when they all collaborated together, and you had local law enforcement who were off reservation involved, it was amazing. I mean, they put him away, not for this, but they ended up putting him away for some significant time. I don't know whether they got good information from it, but the stark contrast when you saw all those resources on him compared to early on it's just remarkable. It's all stuff that could have been done early on if you had the right resources.
You know, and that reminds me of the Gretchen Fleming case. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, out of West Virginia.
A little bit.
Where Preston Peterson was recently charged. And that was a tiny department working with the FBI, working with the U.S. Marshals, working with the ADA's office. And they were able to, throughout the years, put together a case. And then finally, they just took him into custody, I believe, last month.
Yeah. And he's a former police officer, right?
Yeah. He was actually a former cop as well, and a sheriff's deputy. I wanted to ask you, Michele, first of all, Brian had another question about if Sam's version is true, what evidence exists outside of Sam himself to prove Ashley was alive after he last saw her? And I wanted to kind of combine that with Michele, when you're working cases and you do not have a body and you're behind the eight ball, like we discussed before, is there any secret tip or any resource that you're using to flesh out more information, or what do you do with those cases?
Well, you know what? I go back and interview. I unfortunately have been handed a couple cases where there is no body, and I've been handed them as missing person cases that were given to me with the thought that this person's dead. So even though the report still says missing persons, I am investigating it as a homicide. And in this particular situation, what I've done, I have a guy. He's a suspect in this particular case. I've gone out and talked to him 4 different times. And to me, you start at the beginning. So what I did is I started at the beginning, and oddly enough, it was this little girl that was missing from Chicago, 15 years of age. I ended up going back to the last place that she was seen at, and her stuff was still there. So it was kind of like time, time had moved and everything was stuck exactly where it was. So we ended up finding evidence there, and people kind of laughed at me. And I remember I ended up getting phone records from the statement that this offender gave me. And everyone's like, phone records? And these were landline phone records. So I went and I requested it. And I ended up getting them. And they actually corroborated exactly what he said. But so many people in front of me, you assume they did that, right? Like, of course he got phone records. And of course it was negative because, this is Illinois Bell, which is the Bell company that operated the landline. They had the records, even though they're not supposed to have the records. I even went as far to a payphone, and I ended up getting the information on the payphone. And I did get the calls, but I didn't get the origin of the calls. So it's like, go back and do everything from the beginning. And a lot of times we assume if, a detective went out and did stuff, obviously he did the basic stuff. And a lot of times they didn't for whatever reason. And you miss a lot of stuff. And it's also, Jayson might have an interpretation of what he heard. Well, I'll have another interpretation. And when you're dealing with things like this, Indian reservations are kind of their own, their own little country almost.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. And they have different slang. They have different things that they call. They have different ways that they speak. And a lot of times if I'm in there and I'm, basing what they're saying off of what I understand it to be, a lot of times that's not correct. So if you do go back in and you start from the beginning and re-interview people that are willing to talk and listen to jail phone calls and stuff like that, a lot of times you'll get leads there that you don't even realize are right there for you to see. And I've had cases that are basically unsolvable. One of them I was still working up until a few weeks before I retired. But I passed the case over to younger detectives. I'm like, okay, there's other evidence here that hasn't been worked up. And a lot of times, too, with DNA stuff, like when you get clothing and it's worked up and it's sent off, they don't swab the whole thing for DNA. They take parts of it that they believe might have touched the body. So if you have a sweater, they might go underneath the underarm because, you know, you're going to sweat and there might be epithelial skin cells on there. You know, it might be on the cuffs on it. Sometimes DNA is in different parts of it, and just because it's negative doesn't mean it's truly negative. So a lot of times if they haven't consumed all the evidence and, you know, basically destroyed it by examining it, sometimes there is still stuff there that you can work on. A lot of times there's digital evidence that you don't think exists, you know, like in vehicles. A lot of people don't realize there's an infotainment system inside the car, which in certain cars after, you know, I think it's like 2018. A lot of times if you analyze that car, you can find out what time the door was open and closed and when a window went up and down. And a lot of times this system there exists, but it just hasn't been analyzed. So there's so many things like that. There's so many things in this day and age too, like Apple Watches. And I know with Ashley, this is what, 2017. So some of that stuff didn't exist. But I guarantee there were other things, and especially if this guy is involved in drug transactions, there's probably going to be so many other things there that people didn't realize that he did. You know, oh, okay, I was picking up drugs this day or making drugs. Even to make drugs, you have to buy stuff to make drugs.
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to be stuff like going to the store and, you know, talking to people and purchasing stuff. Did he buy it with cash? Did he go to the ATM? Was he just completely, you know, a cash type of guy? So, yeah, I think there's a lot of ways, but basically that was a long answer to start at the beginning and never assume that something was done just because it should have been done.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think that's a perfect way to put it. Right.
Yeah, it's something that gets in the way in a lot of these cases. And I mean, I think there's some examples of that in the case for sure recently where people have thought, of course, taking this example, of course, this X thing cannot be possibly still available, and turned around and we're like, whoa, okay, we were able to get that. And in this particular example, without going down the rabbit hole of what it was that the communications provider had figured out a new way to get historical data that they couldn't get before. And so, yeah.
And that happens a lot lately. Like looking at cold cases, specifically in Chicago, there's data there that we couldn't analyze before, or that we did analyze, and you know, you weren't able to exactly pinpoint certain things. And now the technology has changed where you reanalyze the same evidence. You'll see this a lot in the Karen Reed case, which was all over. You know, I looked at that case because I ended up doing a show. I was on 2020, just analyzing it because local law enforcement couldn't participate in the documentary. So there were so many things there, and it was digital evidence. Yeah, it was digital evidence though that was actually analyzed incorrectly at certain times. Like I can look at it and I'm like, well, no, that's what it is here. And these guys were plotting things, and a lot of times they were plotting evidence and getting more information from plotting the evidence. Well, if you plot the information wrong the first time
in the beginning,
yeah, and then also you have to worry about, you know, fruit of the poisonous tree, because if you go in there and you go and do a search warrant on information that isn't correct, none of that's good. And you just lost a whole trail.
Every search warrant in that piece.
Exactly.
And I completely agree with you that there's so many times where the answer to who the real suspect is was somebody that may have been dismissed in the first week of a case. Or I always think of the one I think about when I think about no body homicides and cold cases is the case of Catherine and Sheila Loring in Maryland, who disappeared from Wheaton Mall. And this was in the late 1970s. And it was a cold case forever. And then, you know, 35, 40 years later, they end up actually arresting and getting a guy to plea. But what had happened was a fresh set of detectives about 6 years before had looked at the case and decided, you know what, we're going to use this as reference materials, but we're going to do it all over again. And they found a witness interview from Lloyd Lee Welch where he just said something that told them, no, there's no way this piece can be true. And they went down the rabbit hole, and it was quite a rabbit hole. And they were able to identify that the girls not only disappeared from the mall, that they were taken to his family's house, and that eventually they were disposed of hundreds of miles away at another family property, Taylor Mountain in southern Appalachia. And so, I look at that case. Mark Bowden wrote a great book about it called The Last Stone. And don't give up. Don't be afraid to look at things fresh and anew.
Yeah, and what you're saying about technology changing, and especially with Ashley being so involved with using Facebook, Meta essentially now, I always question of how much technology is out there and how much technology do we know about, and is there a capability to receive more information from those older messages?
I think there definitely is a possibility of that. And even, all the people, I know there are so many people here that were giving different versions of the story, but I would definitely go back if I was the investigator handling this and re-interview everyone from the beginning, and don't say, okay, you were there that day, right? It would be like, what were you doing? Instead of giving leading questions. And a big thing that would stand out to me too is the clothing. I know we briefly talked about the clothing, but this clothing might not even be hers. I know someone said that the shoe size was small and it might not have been her shoes. And also, do we know if there were other victims, related to this case as well? So I know the fact that the indigenous women are at such high risk for this type of stuff. But when I first heard about this case, I actually thought this was going to be like a sex trafficking thing. We do have a case in Chicago that is connected to sex trafficking in Montana. It doesn't seem like it. Like, from all the stuff that Jayson said and from the notes and everything that I read, I feel like this case is solvable. And I think that these interviews are so much more important than perhaps the other investigators realized.
Yeah. And one of the really interesting things, I was on the Consult podcast, which is made up of retired FBI profilers. And one of the profilers, a guy named Bob Drew, who I really, 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 really respect. But he made this point that often when you're working a cold case and you go back to the people you've already interviewed 5-10 years later, when they've moved, what they were afraid of, and he made the point, they might be fearful of their life. They might be fearful of making their girlfriend mad. Who knows what their fear may be? And you go back to them and you will find out loads of extra information off.
Absolutely. That always happens too. And even with us, when we would have new cases, and a lot of the cases that I worked, unfortunately, were gang cases. So when you do find someone, and it's been a year or two and they moved out of the area, they might be more willing to talk to you and to give you more information. And a lot of times, if you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to get the right answer. So sometimes there's little details there that, we as human beings would miss. And that's why it is good to go back in there and, like you said, use the previous documentation as a guide and as reference, but don't really,
don't rely on it. Right.
Yeah. And summaries can change everything.
Yeah.
That's all really good. I wanted to ask you again, Jayson, one of the things that amazed me the first time you came out, can you give us a quote of how many of Ashley's graduating class in high school are either missing or murdered? Can you give us a ballpark?
I was just thinking about that. So we're talking about a relatively small school, a couple hundred, students at a given time. And, I interviewed Haley Onisu, who was a classmate of Ashley's and a relative of Ashley's, who went to Browning High School with her. She was a couple years ahead of her. She was at the University of Montana. Well, not even really a couple years ahead of her, a year ahead of her. She was at the University of Montana in her sophomore year, and she looked online and saw the flyers for Ashley being missing. And Haley is amazing. She decided at that point she was going into forensic anthropology. She's created a firm called Okoumee Forensics, which focuses on bringing forensic services to reservations. And they've done searches all over the country and some really great work. But what Haley told me was that 10 of her classmates, so she's 27, right? Where's the 27 right now? I think, no, she would have been 27 when I interviewed her. But 10 of her classmates were missing or murdered.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
What do you attribute that to, Jayson? Is it just, well, no, I can't even ask. What do you attribute that to? The fact that 10 out of a class, that's insanity.
Yeah, out of a class that small. I mean, I think that some of it has to do with drugs, domestic violence. I think some of it has to do with, if you look at the number of cases of missing persons in that area, we spent a lot of time focusing on the women. There are also men that are missing or have been murdered. I think it's just truly when you have a system, and you get this, right? You were in Chicago, you kind of know that it's a small group of people who do most of your violent crime.
Very true.
If you knock one of them off, you're probably going to prevent some crime.
Absolutely.
But what happens in an environment where you don't knock those people off? And it
breed.
Right, exactly. And what does it say to the person who maybe would have learned from somebody else getting locked up? Okay, I can go a little closer to the line. So I think a lot of it has to do with the idea that you don't have the law enforcement infrastructure to really bring any kind of accountability for the people who are really, really dangerous. So they're able to repeat the crime, and some of those scarecrow barriers that exist for that person who could go either way don't really exist. So I think that's it's the accountability.
Can I bring up one more issue? Can you give us of how many officers are actually working the reservation and how large
17.
that is?
17.
And how large?
Square feet. I mean, 5 million square acres.
5 million square acres and
larger than the state of Delaware or Rhode Island.
So when you're responding to a call,
let it not be on the far side of the reservation.
You're driving hours.
Yeah. Well, also think about it. You're talking 17 officers. Not all of them are on patrol. A couple of them have administrative jobs.
Right.
It's a 24-hour-a-day job. People actually get colds. There are times where there's only one officer moving on the reservation at any particular time.
And is it also true that they don't have true police powers, where if someone like me, who wasn't a member of the reservation, was there doing something bad, they don't have the powers to arrest me? Is that right?
Correct. Yes, it's mildly absurd. The way the law used to work at the time where Ashley disappeared, the way the law worked at that time was they couldn't even detain you temporarily. Now the law has been changed because of a Supreme Court ruling that the reservation police can detain a non-Indigenous person for enough time that local law enforcement can come and pick them up. But the way it used to be,
why wouldn't I go there and
which is another great point, which ties into your earlier question. 70% of sexual violence against Indigenous women in the United States is committed by white men. And I think it's in part because it's open season when law enforcement can't arrest you. So I can break into a house on the reservation, and right now all they can do is detain me temporarily. And before that, they couldn't even do that. Wow. So it's open season for criminals. I mean, I literally heard of a case in North Dakota recently. A BIA agent told me where, a non-Indigenous father and son, the father goes to the son, says, we're going to go out fishing and we're going to get one of those native girls. And they went on the reservation, kidnapped a woman who was coming home from work, and raped and murdered her. And so that's also a part of the challenge.
It's like hunting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And, even think of something less than, let's say, murder. You just wanted to rob houses. It's a great place to rob houses.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, if I know that a spot the size of Delaware where there are only 17 officers, and I think that can open up some opportunities for criminal activity.
Yeah,
And
But
not only that, but you've got, when we look at the amount of training that takes for someone like Michele to become a homicide detective, not to mention on the job training.
Mhm.
When Michele, she's got a book out, Model Detective, and in that she gives several examples of working with a team of homicide detectives, and they're going out solving complex crimes. But every one of them on that team, it's a competitive process. I believe you said, was it 7,000 or was it 7,000 people applied to be detective when you were detective?
Yes, I studied every single day for 14 hours a day. It was close to 7,000 people who took the test. And about, I mean, I don't remember what the amount was, but not that many. I was number 78 on the list. So I was in the second.
78 out of 7,000.
Yeah, everyone wanted to be a detective back then.
Yeah. And these are people that are training and receiving. I'm sure that you've got, like every state, mandatory training as
Yeah.
well as outsourced
Yeah, you have to
training.
be lead homicide investigator. But then I also was certified by the FBI as a negotiator. And there's all these different types of, blood spatter classes and
Right.
stuff like that. We do get a lot of training. And detectives in general that work either sex crimes or homicides do, we volunteer to go to a lot of stuff because it's only going to help us work the cases better. And especially as technology has changed, it shows us how to write better search warrants. But yeah, I mean, we are very trained, and of course, we had all the oldies that showed us, how to start the investigations, and that right there. I mean, you'll see most cold cases like John Benet Ramsey and all these types of cases are usually detectives that are not homicide detectives that come in. And I always tell people, I'm like, you'll notice a lot of cold cases come up during holiday times when the experienced detectives are off, and it's also a great
That's an
time to
interesting
commit a
perspective.
crime because all the experienced guys, obviously they have the seniority to get off on a holiday, so you might end up with a younger group of less experienced detectives.
Yeah, and I think that just creates just this tidal wave effect where you've got 17 officers, so very few officers are actually working the scene initially. They don't have experience, and they've been officers in a culture that was kind of brought up in an inefficient and, I don't want to say uneducated way, but they don't have the formal training and experience that someone like Michele would. Um, Jayson, when we're looking at where this case is now, and I know that technology is evolving, we're trying to get this case more attention. Is there anything else we can do to help this? Does this need more public support, or what does this
I think
need
it
to get
does.
the resources?
I think it does need public support. I think it's always great. I think sometimes podcasters and people on television and, listeners and viewers don't think they have an impact. But every time they're talking about a case, every time they're pushing for something, there's an opportunity to inspire someone or opportunity to get in the ear of somebody who may know something and may share it. I can give you an example. When Ashley's case ended up on ABC News, there was a woman who was in Alaska, not a member of the tribe, who heard a name in her ear, just had the TV on and was walking by doing her laundry, heard a name in her ear and said to herself, you know what? In 2016, in June, I found mail from one of the potential suspects on my property in Montana. And it dated where that person was on that day. And that's just because she heard it in her ear walking back and forth. And so those things I think really matter. They inspire people to get involved. I know some of the work and some of the conversations that have happened. There is a group of people who have come together on this case, from cadaver dog handlers, search and rescue specialists, a geographic profiler, a former Idaho homicide detective, who have basically put together a group. I'd throw Haley in this group as well, who have basically said, hey, these resources don't exist on the reservation. We're willing to provide them to either law enforcement or the family. And so those kinds of things can make a real difference. And I think we're going to see an example, I don't know in Ashley's case, but another really well-known case. I think we're going to see an example really soon of an older cold case on a reservation getting at least solved or closer to resolution because of some of this coverage of that case. So I think it really does matter. When I went out, some of my listeners to my podcast actually came out and helped with the search. These things really can have an impact and inspire people. So, keep on talking about Ashley, keep on talking about the broader issue. In 2016, there were 6,000 missing Indigenous people, long-term missing Indigenous people in the database. It's a frightening number of people. It can feel overwhelming, but even in the time that I've been following this case, I have seen movement in cases. I've seen movement with resources. I have seen law enforcement respond. And I don't think it's purely because of law enforcement per se. Sometimes it's their communities asking them. Sometimes it's politicians saying, hey, I'm going to let you have the resources to go after this case, right? I think people don't always realize, I know from being a reporter in Baltimore and reporting in New York, that, when a case is what we would call a red ball, a bouncing baby burning red ball, it's because the politicians want answers. They're willing to give the resources. They're willing to drive and allow the department. That does matter. And that matters because the public cares.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, I'm sure that Michele can testify to how important resources are and how important community getting behind a case is. I can tell you one in Raleigh where we had a guy that was going around robbing convenience stores and shooting the clerk. And after about the third one, there's big uproar in the community about it. And, I was put on a task force where, we hunted him. And it was coming in every day with about 30 of us. And having a captain that was giving us any resource we needed. And you know what? Because of that and the community involvement, eventually one of his baby mamas came forward and threw him under the bus, and we're able to take him into custody.
The tree.
Oh yeah. He helped himself. He helped us out because he cheated on her and she found out about it.
So I was, when I was working in New York, there was one day, bang, 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 on the first floor of my building. It's the U.S. Marshals, it's the NYPD, and all they're doing is like banging on this witness's window from the outside. They're just annoying him. And I ask, like, what's going on? They want information from him related to this case. About 3 months later, this guy ends up going in, giving an interview, giving the information, and he lived in my building, and I asked him why. He's like, they just annoyed me into it. Like, these things can really be impactful sometimes when you just shake the tree. He was tired of having them appear everywhere. And, another example is an investigator once told me that there's a case she really cares about, and she keeps a track of podcast episodes related to that case in her Spotify, like a playlist, and she listens to them and they inspire her to push forward. So these things do matter.
They do.
It does. And so I think we can wrap this up. Jayson, I appreciate you coming on. I know that you've got your podcast, Silver Linings Handbook, that people can get on Spotify. Is there anything else that you would like to mention or plug?
No, I mean, I would like to plug people finding a way to help with the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis. There are opportunities to donate to organizations, to support law enforcement, to go do a search, to get involved. You know, I have one listener who donated gas cards to families so they could search, so they could get around a reservation in Nevada to search. You think that there's not a way that you can help? There is a way, and if you're brainstorming and looking for a way, feel free to send me an email and I can give you a bunch of ideas. You can make a difference. You guys make a difference by just listening and supporting these efforts, but you can make a difference in whatever way you want.
Well, Michele, you've got your book, Model Detective. That's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kindle, Audible, anywhere where you can buy a book. You've recently retired, but you're not, I know you're on vacation now, and I appreciate you making time for this, but you're not going to stay on vacation forever. You've actually got some things you're working on. Do you want to tell us about it?
Yeah, I'm actually starting a non-for-profit. What I've always done in my career is answer the phone and connect people, and I still want to continue to do that. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of people out there that don't have the resources that they need, even the stuff that Jayson spoke about. So I started this by myself and with my partner who works in television. And we basically just want to give resources to people that don't have resources. It's basically just, I know a lot of people now, and I'm fortunate enough that I could connect people with other people. I have lots of people who were victims of crimes or were witnesses in crimes and I'm still in contact with. So I feel like with this network of people, I could still continue to help, even though I'm not active law enforcement. So I'm working on that now, and I'm doing it very slowly, organically. And I just want to, I've already got some success stories from just connecting people with media outlets to get their stories out there. And just, you and I have talked about perhaps some of the cases that I'm still looking at. Maybe we'll talk about them on your show just to get some more resources out there and try to solve some of these cases, or at least give people some closure as best we can.
Yeah, anytime you want to come over, or come on, you're welcome. If you want to support me, you can start by liking and subscribing to Santana True Crime. You can also now become a member for $1.95, and that gets you the episodes early, and as well as a few extra things. And you can buy my book, A Murder on Campus, The Professor, the Cop, and North Carolina's Most Notorious Cold Case. You can buy that again on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kindle, Audible, anywhere where you can buy a book. Jayson and Michele, thank you so much again, and good night.
Thank you.
Take care.